Margaret Calloway was 7 years old the first time she understood what it meant to work for something. Her mother, Dolores, had taken a second job that summer, cleaning rooms at a motor lodge off the interstate outside Savannah, Georgia, the kind of place where the parking lot lights buzzed all night and the ice machine down the hall rattled like something trapped inside it. Dolores would leave before Margaret woke up and come home after dark, her feet swollen, her uniform smelling faintly of bleach and someone else's soap. She never complained. She set her tips on the kitchen counter in a small ceramic dish shaped like a magnolia blossom, and at the end of every week, she counted them out loud so Margaret could hear. She wanted her daughter to understand that money had a sound, that it came from somewhere, that it did not arrive on its own. Margaret grew up in a narrow house on a street where most of the neighbors knew each other by name, and most of the fathers worked at the paper mill, and most of the mothers worked everywhere else. She was not the smartest girl in her school, but she was one of the most observant. She noticed things other people walked past. She noticed how the teacher who was respected most was the one who remembered every student's name without looking at the roster. She noticed how the one restaurant in their neighborhood that was always full was the one where the owner stood by the door and greeted people like they were coming home. She filed these things away without knowing yet what she was filing them for. When she was 17, her mother sat her down and told her plainly that there was no money for college. She said it without apology and without shame, the way Dolores said most things, as information, not defeat. Margaret nodded. She had already been thinking about what came next, turning the question over in her mind the way you turn a stone in your hand, feeling for its edges. She had a diploma, and she had her mother's example, and she had a quality that most 17-year-olds don't yet possess: the ability to begin something without knowing exactly where it would end. She took a job at a hotel in downtown Savannah the summer after graduation. Not the grand historic ones on the squares. Those required experience she didn't have yet, but a clean, mid-sized business hotel 2 blocks from the river, the kind of place where traveling salesmen ate breakfast alone and conference attendees moved through the lobby in clusters with lanyards around their necks. Margaret started at the front desk. She was punctual, and she was precise, and she had an instinct for reading people that her supervisor noticed within the first month. When a guest was frustrated, she could de-escalate before the conversation turned difficult. When a guest was uncertain, she could offer exactly the right suggestion without making them feel like they needed guidance. She made people feel, without any visible effort, that they were being looked after. She moved up steadily. Front desk to guest services coordinator. Guest services to assistant manager of operations. By the time she was 26, she was managing a department of 11 people at a property that had given her no reason to expect she would ever be anything other than entry-level. She was saving money with a discipline that bordered on obsessive, not because she was afraid, but because she had a picture in her mind that was getting clearer every year, and she knew that pictures like that required resources to become real. It was at a hospitality industry conference in Charleston when she was 28 that she met Raymond Calloway. He was from a small town in North Carolina, and he had the kind of steadiness about him that Margaret recognized immediately as something rare. Not the steadiness of a man who had never been tested, but the steadiness of a man who had been tested and had not broken. He was a contractor, specializing in commercial renovation, and he had come to the conference because a colleague had an extra ticket and Raymond believed in showing up to things even when you weren't sure why you'd been invited. They talked for 3 hours at a reception neither of them had planned to stay at long. He asked her questions, and he listened to the answers. He did not try to impress her. He simply paid attention, and Margaret, who had spent most of her adult life paying attention to other people, found it startling and quietly wonderful to be on the receiving end of it. They were married 2 years later in a small ceremony in Savannah with Dolores in the front row and Raymond's parents beside her, and a reception that Margaret had largely organized herself because she could not help it, because organizing spaces and moments and the comfort of the people inside them was simply the way her mind worked. Raymond understood this about her. He did not try to change it. He built things, and she filled them with life, and from the very beginning they understood each other at a level that made the ordinary difficulties of a shared life feel manageable. Margaret was 31 when she first told Raymond about the inn. She had seen the listing in a small coastal property newsletter she subscribed to, a 7-room inn on the Georgia coast, 2 miles from a beach that tourists were beginning to discover, priced low because the current owner had run out of the will to keep it going. The photographs showed peeling shutters and a wraparound porch that needed work and a kitchen that hadn't been updated since the 1980s. Raymond looked at the photographs for a long time. Then he looked at Margaret. He asked her if she was sure. She told him she had never been more sure of anything in her professional life. He nodded, set the newsletter down, and said, "Then let's talk about what it would take." What it took was everything they had saved and a loan that made Margaret's chest tight every time she thought about the monthly payment and 18 months of work that consumed almost every weekend and most of the evenings in between. Raymond handled the structural renovation himself where he could, bringing in his own crew for the larger jobs, saving the money at every turn without sacrificing the quality that Margaret refused to compromise on. She made every design decision herself. The paint colors, the furniture, the bathroom fixtures, the way the breakfast room was laid out so that guests could sit by the window and look out at the marsh grass moving in the morning light. She wrote the menu herself. She trained the 2 staff members they could afford to hire. She was present for every detail because she understood, in a way she couldn't fully articulate but felt completely, that the details were not separate from the experience. They were the experience. They were the thing guests would carry home with them and describe to other people in the particular way that human beings describe places that made them feel genuinely cared for. The inn opened on a Friday in early October. They had 4 reservations for the first weekend, 2 couples who had found the listing online, 1 family visiting a relative nearby, and Dolores, who had driven down from Savannah and sat on the porch in the afternoon light with a glass of sweet tea and told her daughter quietly that she was proud of her in the way that Dolores expressed pride, which was once, directly, without repetition, because she believed once was enough if you meant it. By the following spring, the inn had a wait list. By the following summer, it had been mentioned in a regional travel publication. By the end of its second full year of operation, it had a 4.9 rating on every platform that listed it and a return guest rate that the Regional Hospitality Association cited as among the highest they had recorded for a property its size. Margaret read the citation at her kitchen table and felt something she had difficulty naming. Not quite pride, something quieter and more durable than pride. The feeling of a thing becoming what you always believed it could be. She and Raymond had their first child, Daniel, when Margaret was 34. Their daughter Simone followed 2 years later. Then their youngest, Claire, 2 years after that. Margaret did not stop working when her children arrived. She restructured. She hired more carefully. She built systems that could run without her physical presence for stretches of time, while also understanding that there were things no system could replace. Her eye, her instinct, her willingness to walk through a property and feel immediately what was right and what needed attention. She traveled with infants and toddlers and small children who grew up thinking that hotel lobbies were a normal backdrop for family life, because for them they were. Raymond was the anchor at home when she traveled. He did this without complaint and without resentment, and with a warmth toward their children that Margaret watched with something close to awe. He coached Daniel's Little League team. He drove Simone to her dance recitals. He read to Claire every night in a voice that made even books she had already heard feel new. He was, in the fullest sense of the word, a partner, not in the contractual sense, but in the true one. The kind of partnership where 2 people's strengths fit together so naturally that the combined thing they build is larger than either of them could have managed alone. By the time Margaret was 42, they had sold the original inn and used the profit to purchase 2 new properties simultaneously, a coastal inn in South Carolina and a small boutique hotel outside Savannah that catered to the wedding market. Raymond had retired from his contracting business to work alongside her full-time, managing the renovation and construction side of every new acquisition, while Margaret handled operations, hospitality standards, and the financial architecture of what had quietly, steadily, without announcement or fanfare, become a small but serious business empire. They did not talk about it in those terms. They talked about the properties the way you talk about things you have built with your hands, specifically, practically, with attention to the particular challenges of each one. But both of them understood what was accumulating. Both of them could see where it was going. The Harborview Grand was Margaret's idea from the beginning. She had been watching a stretch of South Carolina coastline for 3 years before she made her move, tracking development patterns, monitoring tourism numbers, talking quietly to local real estate contacts who understood she was serious without needing her to explain why. The land she identified was not oceanfront. It was a 5-acre parcel set back slightly from the water, elevated enough to give a clear view of the marina below, surrounded by mature live oaks that she refused to touch during construction because she understood immediately that they were the kind of feature no architect could replicate and no budget could replace. She purchased the land on a Tuesday afternoon and called Raymond from the car on the way home and told him the number. There was a long pause. Then he said, "How big are we thinking?" And Margaret said, "Bigger than anything we've done before." And Raymond said, "All right then, tell me what you need." The project took 3 years from groundbreaking to opening. It was the most complex thing Margaret had ever attempted, and there were moments, more than she would later admit, when the scale of it pressed down on her in the small hours of the morning, and she lay awake running numbers in her head and questioning whether she had overestimated herself. Raymond would feel her awake beside him, and he would not say anything, because he had learned over the years that what Margaret needed in those moments was not reassurance, but presence. And he gave her that without being asked, simply turning toward her in the dark, and somehow that was enough. The Harborview Grand opened on a Thursday in April when Margaret was 51 years old. 214 rooms, 2 full-service restaurants, a spa, a private marina with boat rental and fishing charter services, conference facilities that could accommodate groups of up to 300. A rooftop terrace that looked out over the water and the low country landscape in a way that stopped people mid-sentence when they first saw it. Margaret stood at the entrance on opening morning in a navy dress she had bought specifically for the occasion and watched the first guests arrive and felt Raymond's hand find hers, and she did not cry until she was alone in the presidential suite that evening, sitting on the private terrace in the dark, listening to the water. The years that followed were the fullest of her professional life. The Harborview Grand became what she had always believed it could become, not just a successful property, but a destination, a place people planned their year around, a name that carried meaning in the way that only a handful of independent properties ever managed to achieve without the backing of a major brand or a franchise model. She won awards she hadn't sought. She was asked to speak at conferences. She hired and developed a team of people she was genuinely proud of. Philip Okafor, who joined as assistant manager and grew into the general manager role with a quiet competence that mirrored her own. James Whitfield in the restaurant, who had a gift for hospitality that Margaret recognized as something that could not be taught. A dozen others who had come to her as young professionals and grown into the best versions of themselves in an environment she had built. Raymond's diagnosis came in the spring of the year Margaret turned 62. Pancreatic cancer, stage 3, delivered in a doctor's office on a Wednesday afternoon with a specificity and finality that made the fluorescent lights above them feel suddenly, absurdly intrusive. Margaret held Raymond's hand in that office and did not look away from the doctor and did not allow her face to show what was happening inside her chest. Raymond, characteristically, asked practical questions. He wanted to understand the timeline. He wanted to understand what the treatment would involve. He wanted to understand what the options were and what the realistic outcomes attached to each option were. The doctor answered him carefully. Margaret listened to every word. They fought it for 14 months. Raymond underwent treatment with the same steadiness he had brought to everything else in his life. Not passively, not with false peace, but with a clear-eyed intention to be present for as much time as he had. He was present. He came to every family dinner he could manage. He video called the grandchildren when he couldn't travel. He sat on the porch in the evenings when the weather was good and watched the light change over the yard and talked to Margaret about things they had never quite found time to talk about in 40 years of forward motion. Memories from early in their marriage, things the children had done that had made him laugh, the particular satisfaction of having built something real together and being able to look back at it and see it whole. He died on a Sunday morning in September, at home, in the bedroom they had shared for 33 years, with Margaret beside him. She was 63 years old. She had been with Raymond for 35 years. She understood, sitting in that room after, with the morning light coming through the curtains and the house quieter than it had ever been, that the rest of her life would be divided into before and after, and that the after had just begun. She grieved deeply, and she grieved privately, and she did not stop working. Not because work was an escape. She had never been the kind of person who used occupation as avoidance, but because the business she and Raymond had built together was a living thing, and living things require attention, and attending to it was one of the ways she remained connected to him. She made decisions in those first months after his death, and then asked herself silently what Raymond would have thought. And the answers that came back to her were so clearly his voice that she sometimes had to set down whatever she was holding and simply breathe for a moment. Her children grieved in their own ways. Daniel, the eldest, became more protective of her in a manner that was loving at its root, but occasionally edged into something that felt like management, checking in more than necessary, asking questions about her finances that she found quietly insulting, suggesting on more than one occasion that she might consider stepping back from the business now that she didn't need to push so hard. Simone, her middle child, lived in Seattle with her husband and 2 sons and processed grief at a physical distance that was partly geography and partly the particular emotional self-sufficiency that Simone had always possessed. Claire, the youngest, was the most openly sad of the 3 and called Margaret more often than either of her siblings and sometimes said nothing in particular and simply stayed on the phone, which Margaret understood was its own form of care. None of them, in the years following Raymond's death, asked Margaret much about the business. They asked how she was doing. They asked whether she was eating properly and sleeping enough and getting out of the house. They did not ask about the Virginia property she was evaluating or the renovation underway at the Savannah Hotel or the conversation she was having with a developer about a potential partnership project in Hilton Head. They had, without quite deciding to, filed the business away in the category of things that belonged to her former life, hers and Raymond's together, rather than understanding it as the living, growing, forward-moving enterprise it continued to be. Margaret noticed this. She did not address it directly. She stored the observation somewhere quiet and kept moving. By the time the family trip email arrived, she had been widowed for 5 years. She had continued to run her portfolio with the same attention and intention she always had. The Harborview Grand had just completed its best fiscal year since opening. She had finalized a deal on a new property in coastal Virginia that she was quietly excited about. A historic inn with good bones and extraordinary views and a reputation that needed rebuilding, which was precisely the kind of challenge she had always found most satisfying. She was 68 years old and she was, by any honest measure, at the top of her professional life. She knew this. She did not require anyone else to know it. But the email, when it came, clarified something she had been sensing for a while without fully naming. Her children did not see her the way she was. They saw a version of her, the mother version, the widow version, the woman of a certain age version, and that version, in their imaginations, was winding down, was stepping back, was ready, or nearly ready, to occupy the quieter, smaller, more peripheral role that the culture assigned to women once their children were grown and their husbands were gone, and their most visible years of striving were presumed to be behind them. They were not cruel people. They were not even wrong to love her the way they did. But they were missing something essential, and the email made that unmistakable. Margaret read it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with her coffee going cold beside her. She read Daniel's careful, measured sentences. She read Renata's warm, apologetic postscript. She sat with it for a long moment, long enough to feel the full weight of what was being said beneath what was written, which was not that she was unloved, but that she was, in some fundamental way, no longer fully seen. Then she set her phone down, looked out the window at the yard, and thought about Raymond. She thought about what he would have said. She thought she could almost hear him. And then she picked up her phone and called her assistant. And her voice when she spoke was entirely steady, because Margaret Calloway had spent 40 years building things in the face of difficulty, and this was not difficulty. This was simply information, and she knew exactly what to do with it. The flight from Savannah to Charleston was an hour and 12 minutes. Margaret spent most of it reviewing notes on the Virginia property, occupancy projections, renovation cost estimates, a preliminary staffing plan she had been developing over the previous 2 weeks. She was not performing busyness. She was simply working, the way she had always worked, in the margins of travel and transition, because her mind did not require a desk to function and never had. The flight attendant brought her sparkling water without being asked. Margaret had flown this route enough times that the crew on the regular morning service knew her preferences, and she thanked her by name and returned to her notes. The car service met her at arrivals. Marcus, who had been driving her on this route for 7 years, loaded her single bag into the back without comment and pulled out of the airport with the quiet efficiency she appreciated. They exchanged a few words about the weather and about his daughter, who had recently started college. Margaret had remembered to ask, because she always remembered, and then settled into a comfortable silence for the drive down to the coast. Margaret watched the low country landscape pass outside the window, the flat marshes, the long bridges over tidal rivers, the live oaks that draped Spanish moss over Tulane roads like something from a painting, and felt the particular quality of arrival that this drive had always produced in her. Not quite homecoming, something adjacent to it. The feeling of returning to a place that knew who you were. Philip was standing outside the entrance of the Harborview Grand when the car pulled up, which was not protocol for a guest arrival, but was absolutely protocol for this particular arrival. He had been general manager for 8 years, and in that time had developed an understanding of Margaret that was part professional deference and part genuine respect, and part the simple recognition that the woman who had built this place and entrusted it to his care deserved to be received accordingly. He opened the car door himself. He shook her hand with both of his. They walked through the lobby together at a pace that was neither hurried nor deliberately slow, the pace of two people with things to discuss who also understand the value of noticing the space around them. Margaret observed the lobby the way she always did on arrival, not with the eye of an owner looking for problems, though she would note anything that needed attention, but with the eye of a guest. What does this room feel like to someone walking through it for the first time? What does it say? Is it saying what it's meant to say? The flowers at the reception desk were right. The lighting in the seating area was slightly warm in a way she liked. A young staff member at the concierge desk caught her eye and nodded. She didn't know his name yet. She would learn it before she left. Philip walked her through the week's operational picture as they moved toward the elevator. Occupancy was at 91%, which was strong for early summer. The restaurant had a full reservation book through the weekend. There was a small conference group checking in on Friday that had some specific catering requirements he wanted her to be aware of, not because they were problematic, but because he had learned over the years that Margaret preferred to know the texture of the house she was staying in. She asked 2 questions, both of which he answered immediately and completely, which was one of the reasons she had promoted him and one of the reasons she had kept him. She did not like to ask a question twice. He handed her the white envelope at the elevator, the presidential suite key, along with a handwritten note from the kitchen confirming that her preferred welcome arrangement had been set up in the room. She thanked him. The elevator doors closed, and she rode to the top floor alone. And when she stepped out into the private corridor that led to the suite, she felt something that she had felt on every visit here for 19 years, a particular, irreducible sense of arrival. Not at a place she owned, though she did own it. At a place she had willed into existence. There was a difference, and it mattered to her. The suite was as it always was, generous and quiet and suffused with the specific quality of light that came off the water in late afternoon, the kind of light that made everything in a room look considered. She set her bag in the bedroom and changed out of her travel clothes, and then took her notes and her phone out to the terrace and sat down in the chair closest to the railing, the one that faced directly out over the marina, and spent the next 2 hours working in the way she found most productive, unhurried, without interruption, with the sound of the water below and the occasional movement of a boat through the marina frame serving as the kind of ambient backdrop that her mind had always found generative rather than distracting. She had dinner alone that evening at a small table by the window in Coastal, the main restaurant, which was her custom on the first night of any visit. A quiet meal, good food, time to settle into the rhythm of the property before her days became more structured. James Whitfield came out of the kitchen to greet her personally, as he always did, and they spent a few minutes discussing the current menu. He had added a new preparation for the local grouper that he was pleased with and wanted her opinion on. She ordered it. It was excellent. She told him so with the same specificity she brought to every evaluation, not just that it was good, but why it was good, which aspects of it worked, and how they worked, because James was the kind of chef who valued that level of engagement, and because Margaret had always believed that the best thing a leader could give their team was the experience of being genuinely seen. She slept well. She woke early, as she always did, and had coffee on the terrace as the sun came up over the water. She called her assistant about the Virginia property. She reviewed a contract her lawyer had sent. She took a long walk along the waterfront path below the property, nodding to the early morning joggers, and the couple walking a small dog, and the fisherman who had set up at the end of the public pier with the patient stillness of someone for whom the catching was secondary to the being there. She returned to the suite, showered, dressed, and went downstairs to check in with Philip about the day. Daniel and Renata arrived on Saturday morning. Margaret was in a meeting with Philip and the conference coordinator when the system showed their check-in. A small notification on the tablet she kept beside her that she registered without comment and did not mention. She finished her meeting. She had lunch in her suite. She spent the afternoon reviewing renovation plans for the Virginia property spread across the dining table, making notes in the margins in the precise handwriting that Raymond had always teased her about. "Too neat," he said, "for someone moving that fast." She thought about him briefly and smiled and kept working. She did not seek Daniel and Renata out. She did not arrange to be seen. She had not come here to stage a confrontation or to construct a scene. She had come here because this was her property, and she had work to do, and she had every right in the world to be exactly where she was. What happened next would happen naturally, the way true things tend to happen when you stop managing them and simply allow reality to be itself. It happened at dinner. She had made a reservation at Coastal for 7:30, not under her own name, which was flagged in the system, but under her assistant's name, which she sometimes used when she wanted to experience the restaurant as a guest rather than as the owner. She was seated at the corner table in the private alcove near the window, the one she preferred because it gave her a clear view of the room without placing her at the center of it. She ordered the tasting menu. She had a glass of the white burgundy she liked. She was reading something on her phone, an article about sustainable hospitality practices that a colleague had sent, when James came to her table and leaned down and told her quietly that there was a couple at table 14 who had given their name as Calloway upon reservation. Margaret did not look up immediately. She finished the sentence she was reading. Then she set her phone face down on the table and looked across the room to where Daniel and Renata sat by the window, studying their menus, unaware. She watched them for a moment. Her son, with his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, and Renata beside him, turning a page in the menu with the focused expression of someone who took restaurants seriously. They looked well. They looked comfortable. They looked entirely at ease in a room they did not know belonged to the woman who had raised the man sitting across from them. She told James she would like to say hello. She asked him to let them know the owner of the property was in this evening and wondered if they might be open to a visit. She watched from across the room as James approached their table, delivered the message, and stepped back. She watched Daniel's face as he processed what had been said. She watched his eyes move to the alcove. She watched the exact moment when he found her face in the dim light of the restaurant, and understanding began, slowly and incompletely, to arrive. She raised her glass toward him. Just slightly. Just enough. And then she waited. Daniel walked across the restaurant toward his mother with the careful, measured stride of a man who was doing several things at once. Approaching a table, processing information, and managing an expression that was not quite sure yet what it wanted to be. Renata came beside him, her hand finding his arm in the automatic way of long partnership, her own face moving through a version of the same recalibration. Margaret watched them come. She had spent 40 years reading people in lobbies and dining rooms and conference spaces, and she read them now with the same quiet attentiveness she had always brought to the people in front of her. She stood when they reached the table. She kissed Daniel's cheek. She embraced Renata warmly. She gestured to the chairs across from her and said, simply, "Sit down, both of you. I've already ordered wine." For a moment nobody said anything. Daniel looked at his mother across the candlelit table with an expression she had not seen on his face since he was a boy. Open, uncertain, stripped of the particular management he had brought to most of their interactions in recent years, the careful, calibrated affection of a grown child who believed, however gently, that he understood his mother's situation better than she did. He looked at her now without that layer. He looked at her the way you look at someone when the story you have been telling yourself about them has just been interrupted. He asked her how she was here. He asked it simply, without theater, the way you ask a question when you are genuinely asking. Margaret told him. She started at the beginning, the land, the architecture firm she had hired, the 3 years of construction, the opening day. She told him about Philip and about James, and about the rooftop terrace and the marina below and the live oaks she had refused to cut down because some things were worth building around. She told him about the presidential suite with her name in the system. She told him about the chef who called before updating the seasonal menu. She told him all of this in the same tone she used when she was briefing her operations team. clear, specific, without drama, because the facts themselves were sufficient, and she had never believed that a story needed inflation to be told. Renata listened with her hands folded on the table and her eyes moving between Margaret's face and the room around them, recalibrating the space in real time, reassigning its meaning. Daniel listened with a stillness that Margaret recognized as the particular stillness of a person receiving information that requires significant internal reorganization. She let him take his time. She was not in a hurry. She had learned, across 4 decades of professional life, that the most important conversations were rarely the fastest ones. When she finished, the table was quiet for a moment. Then Daniel said, "Mom, why didn't you ever tell us?" It was not quite a question. It was something between a question and an observation, with something else underneath it, something that sounded, if you were listening closely, like the beginning of an apology that had not yet found its form. Margaret considered this. She turned her wine glass slowly on the table by its stem, the way she often did when she was thinking, a habit so old she no longer noticed it. Then she looked at her son and told him the truth. She said she had not hidden it deliberately. She said the business had always been something she did rather than something she announced, because the doing was the point. She said she had not wanted her children to relate to her as an asset or a portfolio or a figure to be impressed by. She had wanted them to know her as their mother, and their mother was what she had tried, always, to be in the spaces they occupied together. But then she said something else. She said that being their mother did not mean being only their mother. She said that a woman did not become smaller when her children grew up. She said that the years she had lived since Raymond died were not lesser years. Not years of diminishment or decline or quiet waiting, but full years, active years, years in which she had continued to build and decide and lead and grow. She said she understood that the culture made it easy to forget this about women of her age. She said she understood that her own children, whom she loved without reservation, had fallen into that forgetting without meaning to. And she said, finally, that the email had clarified something she needed them to understand clearly. She was not a woman to be managed or protected or gently redirected to the sidelines of her own life. She was 68 years old, and she was the most professionally accomplished she had ever been, and she intended to remain exactly that for as long as she was able, and she expected the people who loved her to see her accordingly. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence from the one before. Daniel looked at his mother for a long time without speaking. Then he reached across the table and took her hand and held it the way he had held it as a small boy, not with the protective grip of an adult child managing a parent, but with something older and simpler and more honest than that. He said, "I'm sorry, Mom." He said it without qualification or explanation, because he understood, in the way that people sometimes suddenly understand things they should have understood long before, that the explanation was not what was needed. Margaret squeezed his hand. She told him she knew. She told him she loved him. She told him that what she wanted from him going forward was not apology, but attention, the kind of attention that sees a person as they actually are rather than as a version of them that is easier to understand. He nodded. Renata, across the table, had tears at the edges of her eyes that she did not wipe away, and Margaret looked at her with a warmth that was entirely genuine, because she understood that Renata had written that note in the email from a place of care, however misguided, and care, even when it missed the mark, was worth something. They had dinner together that evening. The full tasting menu, with the wine pairings, the conversation moving from the difficult to the ordinary and back again in the natural rhythm of a family that loves each other even when it fails to fully see each other. James sent out 2 additional courses that were not on the menu, because he knew the owner was at that table and he wanted the evening to be what an evening should be. Margaret told Daniel about the Virginia property and watched his face change as she described it. Watched him shift from the polite listening of a son humoring his mother's hobby to the genuine engaged attention of a person encountering something real and significant. She answered his questions. He had good questions. She had always known he was intelligent. She was glad, now, to have the occasion to show him where that intelligence had come from. Simone and her husband arrived Sunday afternoon. Claire and her partner came Monday morning. Margaret let each of them find their own version of the moment. Let the property speak for itself. Let Philip's professional deference and James's extraordinary food and the live oaks and the terrace and the water do what they did, which was to make the invisible visible. By Monday evening, all three of her children had sat with her individually and said versions of the same thing, each in their own language, that they had not seen her clearly, and that they were sorry, and that they wanted to do better. Margaret received each of these conversations with the same grace. She was not performing forgiveness. She did not require forgiveness, because she had not been broken. But she received what they offered because she understood that the offering mattered, that the willingness to be wrong and to say so was one of the better qualities a person could demonstrate, and she had always tried to acknowledge better qualities when she saw them. She had breakfast with all five of them on Tuesday morning on the presidential terrace. She had called the kitchen the night before and asked for something special, not elaborate, just generous, the kind of breakfast that takes its time, that gives people room to sit and talk, and let the morning be what a morning at a place like this could be. The food arrived in stages, unhurried. The water below moved in the early light. The live oaks were visible at the edges of the view, unchanged and unhurried, the way old living things are when they have been allowed to simply be. Her daughter looked at her across the table at some point during that breakfast with an expression that Margaret would carry with her long after the week was over, an expression of recalibrated love, of seeing someone freshly, of the particular tenderness that arrives when you realize how much of a person you have been missing. She said, "Mom, I didn't know any of this." And Margaret smiled and said, "I know. That's the thing about people. You think you know them completely, and then you find out you were only ever seeing one room of the house." She flew home on Friday. The car service took her to the airport. The flight was smooth, and the morning was clear, and she arrived back in Savannah in the early afternoon with the particular quality of returning that belongs to people who have somewhere real to return to. Her house was quiet and warm and full of the accumulated presence of a life that had been fully lived in it. She had calls scheduled for Monday. The Virginia property. A renovation review at one of her existing hotels. A conversation with a young woman in Atlanta who had written her a letter, handwritten, on good paper, which Margaret had noticed, asking for advice on purchasing her first inn. Margaret had written back within the week, because she believed in responding to letters like that quickly, before the writer's courage had time to diminish. She had agreed to the call. She had already begun thinking about what to say, not because she owed it to anyone, not because she was performing generosity, but because Dolores Reeves had once counted her tips out loud into a ceramic dish shaped like a magnolia blossom so her daughter could hear, and Margaret had never forgotten what it meant to have someone take your beginning seriously. She intended to take this young woman's beginning seriously. She intended, as she always had, to show up for the next thing. There are women in this world who build quietly, who do not announce what they are creating or seek recognition for its dimensions, who work in the early morning and the late evening and in the margins of everything else, who make decisions and absorb setbacks and keep moving forward with a consistency that looks, from the outside, like patience but is in fact something else entirely, a kind of faith in the value of the work itself, independent of whether the work is witnessed. These women are often underestimated. The culture has a long habit of underestimating them. The people closest to them sometimes underestimate them most of all, not from cruelty, but from the particular blindness that proximity can produce, the way you can live inside a landscape for so long that you stop seeing its scale. Margaret Calloway had been underestimated, in one way or another, for most of her life. She had been underestimated at 23 when she walked into her first hotel job in a second-hand blazer. She had been underestimated at 31 when she told people she was buying a rundown inn on the Georgia coast with money she had saved herself. She had been underestimated at 63 when she buried her husband and kept running a 9-property portfolio without breaking stride. And she had been underestimated at 68 by her own children, who loved her completely and saw her partially and sent her a careful email explaining that the trip was for couples and that she might feel out of place. She had never required anyone's belief in order to build. She had never needed to be seen in order to continue. But she had wanted, for her children particularly, to be known, not as a version of herself that was comprehensible and manageable and suitably diminished, but as the full thing, the actual woman, with all of her history and all of her capability and all of her forward motion intact. She had wanted them to know who they came from. She had wanted them to carry that knowledge forward, to let it shape what they believed was possible for themselves and for the women in their own lives who were doing the quiet work that the world habitually failed to see. She believed they knew now. She believed, sitting on the plane in the early afternoon light with the coast of South Carolina disappearing behind her, and the future arranged ahead of her in the form of calls and contracts, and a new property that needed everything she had to give it, that her children would carry this week with them, that they would think of her differently, that they would see, in the women around them who were no longer young, not the conclusion of something but the continuation of it. She opened her notes on the Virginia property. She began to think.